June 19, 1944. Above the Philippine Sea, Lieutenant Zenji Abe banks his Mitsubishi A6M0 into attack position, leading his squadron toward the American carrier formation below. He has survived 37 combat missions. His wingmen are veterans of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway. They fly in perfect formation, just as their training demands. Below them, 15 American carriers steam in circular defensive arrangements. Abe watches the first American shells climbing toward his formation. Standard 5-inch anti-aircraft rounds, he thinks. He has seen thousands before. The American gunners always fire too early, their shells exploding uselessly in empty sky while Japanese pilots adjust their approach angles. But these shells behave differently. They don't wait for predetermined timing to explode. They seem to sense his aircraft's presence. The first shell detonates 70 feet from his left wing. Not a near miss that explodes harmlessly. A perfect kill. Radius achieved without direct impact. The blast wave tears through his squadron. 3 Zeros disintegrate instantly. Abe's cockpit fills with shrapnel holes. His radio dies. His hydraulics fail. As he struggles to maintain control, more shells detonate around him with impossible precision. Every burst appears exactly where it needs to be, exactly when it needs to be there. The Americans have created ammunition that explodes before missing. In the carnage that follows, 400 Japanese aircraft will be destroyed by defensive fire that never misses. The technology behind this slaughter began not in a military laboratory, but in the desperate calculations of scientists who understood that conventional weapons were failing catastrophically. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematical reality of aerial warfare had become undeniable by late 1941. American anti-aircraft guns achieved hit rates below 1% against maneuvering aircraft. British data from the London Blitz confirmed the brutal statistics. 20,000 shells fired to destroy a single German bomber. The problem wasn't American courage or training, it was physics. Traditional anti-aircraft shells relied on mechanical time fuses, clockwork mechanisms set by hand before firing. Gunners estimated the range to an approaching aircraft, calculated how long their shell would take to reach that altitude, cranked a small dial on the fuse to match that timing, and fired. If everything was perfect, if the aircraft maintained exactly the same speed and heading, if atmospheric conditions matched their assumptions, the shell would explode near enough to bring it down. The reality proved far more brutal. A diving aircraft traveling at 350 miles per hour covered over 2,000 feet in the 4 seconds it took a shell to climb to 15,000 feet. Miss the timing calculation by 0.3 of a second, less time than it takes to blink, and $50 worth of precision ammunition exploded uselessly while the enemy aircraft continued its attack, run unharmed. Pearl Harbor demonstrated this failure with devastating clarity. American 5-inch anti-aircraft guns unleashed 1,400 rounds at incoming Japanese aircraft on December 7, 1941. Confirmed enemy kills, 0. $70,000 of ammunition wasted in 90 minutes while Zeros and Vals dove through the smoke unharmed. Worse, many shells fell back to earth unexploded, killing American civilians in Honolulu neighborhoods miles from the harbor. The horrible irony was inescapable. American defensive fire posed nearly as much danger to American citizens as it did to Japanese attackers. Dr. Merle Tuve understood something that admirals and generals reviewing those same reports did not. This wasn't a failure of courage. It was a failure of technology. The 41-year-old physicist, with steady hands developed from childhood summers repairing farm equipment in South Dakota, had been pursuing a radically different approach since early 1941. What if artillery shells could make their own targeting decisions? The concept originated from a childhood memory of setting mousetraps in his family's barn. You couldn't predict exactly where a mouse would run, but you could place traps along every possible route. The trap would spring when the mouse came close enough to trigger the mechanism. Could an artillery shell function the same way, waiting until an enemy aircraft approached within lethal range before detonating automatically? The technical challenges seemed insurmountable. A proximity fuse would require packing a complete radar transmitter, receiver, antenna, and firing circuit into the nose cone of a 5-inch shell. The electronics would have to survive launch forces of 20,000 times Earth's gravity, enough to crush any conventional vacuum tube into powder. The system would need to operate reliably at altitudes up to 30,000 feet in temperatures as low as -40 degrees Fahrenheit, all within a package costing less than $50. In 1941, the smallest military radar installation filled an entire room and required trained technicians to operate. The idea of shrinking such complexity into a device smaller than a coffee can struck most engineers as pure fantasy. Pentagon artillery officers were even more skeptical. Vacuum tubes were delicate laboratory instruments. Artillery shells were designed to destroy things through brute force. The two concepts seemed fundamentally incompatible. But Pearl Harbor changed the equation. Dr. Vannevar Bush, the MIT engineer who commanded America's entire wartime research effort, summoned Fuze to Washington 3 weeks after the attack. Bush's office overlooked the Potomac River, where construction crews worked around the clock to complete the massive Pentagon building. Bush wasted no time on pleasantries. The Navy wants better fire control computers. The Army wants improved gun mounts. I want something that actually works. He slid a folder across his desk containing production schedules and budget authorizations. $2 million, 6 months. Make me shells that can think for themselves, or I'll find someone who can. Fuze returned to Baltimore carrying the weight of America's defensive crisis. Every day his team spent in research meant more American sailors and soldiers would face enemy aircraft with weapons that missed 99 times out of 100. The Proximity Fuse project, previously considered an interesting technical challenge, had become a matter of national survival. By March 1942, Fuze's team at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory had transformed their basement laboratory into something resembling a cross between a radio repair shop and a munitions factory. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with oscilloscopes, signal generators, and dozens of prototype vacuum tubes no larger than a man's thumb. The air smelled of hot solder and electrical ozone as engineers worked 18-hour shifts, driven by reports of American ships under constant air attack in the Pacific. The technical mountain they faced seemed to grow higher with each design meeting. A proximity fuse would need to squeeze the functionality of a room-sized radar installation into a space 5 inches in diameter and 8 inches tall. The electronics would have to survive, launch accelerations that would instantly crush standard vacuum tubes into metallic dust. The system needed to generate its own electrical power, detect aircraft at precisely 70 feet, and cost less than a conventional mechanical fuse when mass-produced. Dr. Ralph Baldwin, Fuze's lead electronics engineer, had spent weeks calculating power requirements. We need 0.4 of a watt for transmission, another 0.2 for the receiver circuits, he reported during a particularly frustrating design session. Standard batteries can't survive the launch forces, and we can't make the fuse large enough to hold batteries that could. The power problem seemed unsolvable until Baldwin remembered the spring-driven phonographs from his childhood. If a mechanical spring could spin a turntable for an entire symphony, perhaps it could power an electrical generator for the 25 seconds an artillery shell remained in flight. The solution emerged from this insight, a tiny generator powered by a spring wound rotor that would spin during flight, creating just enough electricity to operate the radar for the duration of the shell's trajectory. The antenna presented an equally complex challenge. Any external radio antenna would be torn off instantly by the forces of firing and flight. Fuze's solution was elegant in its simplicity. The antenna was the shell itself. 4 metal strips built into the nose cone would create a radio beam pattern, extending 70 feet in all directions around the shell's path. But the greatest challenge remained the vacuum tubes themselves. Standard military radio tubes shattered at 500 times Earth's gravity of acceleration. Artillery shells experienced forces 50 times greater during firing. RCA's tube division, working under intense secrecy in Harrison, New Jersey, began developing subminiature tubes specifically designed for proximity fuses. Each tube measured just 0.4 of an inch in diameter, with specially reinforced filaments and shock-absorbing mounting systems designed to function at 25,000 times Earth's gravity. The breakthrough came from Dr. James Van Allen, a young physicist who would later discover the radiation belts surrounding Earth. He proposed ruggedizing the tubes by filling them with special gas mixtures and using thicker filament wire. "If we can't make them unbreakable," Van Allen argued, "we can make them tough enough to keep working even when damaged." By July 1942, the team had assembled their first functional prototype. The complete fuse weighed just over 2 pounds and contained more electronic complexity than most commercial radios of the era. 5 miniature vacuum tubes, a spring-powered generator, precision timing circuits, and a radio transmitter capable of detecting aircraft within a 70-foot radius. All packaged in a container smaller than a soup can and designed to survive being shot from a cannon. Initial testing at Dahlgren Naval Proving Ground in Virginia revealed both promise and problems. Test shells fired at radio-controlled target drones achieved an 85% detonation rate within lethal range. The proximity fuses were thinking correctly, detecting targets and firing at precisely the right moment. But a disturbing pattern emerged. The fuses occasionally detonated when passing near the firing ship's own superstructure, activated by radio reflections from steel masts and radar antennas. The friendly fire problem threatened to doom the entire project. Navy gunnery officers rightfully feared weapons that might detonate near their own ships, potentially killing American sailors with shrapnel from their own ammunition. Fuze's team spent weeks adjusting the sensitivity settings, fine-tuning the radar beam patterns to distinguish between aircraft-sized targets and ship structures. The solution required developing discrimination circuits, electronic systems that could differentiate between the radio signature of an aircraft wing and the reflection from a ship's superstructure. The circuits analyzed not just the strength of returning radio signals, but their patterns and movement characteristics. Aircraft produced distinct radar signatures different from stationary ship structures, allowing the fuse to recognize legitimate targets while ignoring friendly installations. Production planning began even as testing continued. The Bureau of Ordnance estimated they would need millions of proximity fuses if the system proved successful in combat. American factories would have to mass-produce electronic devices more complex than most commercial radios, using manufacturing techniques that had never been attempted on such a scale. By December 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, the first production proximity fuses rolled off assembly lines in plants across the American Midwest. Factory workers, many of them women who had entered industrial employment for the first time due to wartime labor shortages, assembled tiny electronic components with meticulous care. They understood that every fuse leaving their workstations would soon be flying toward enemy aircraft, carrying the hopes of American sailors and soldiers who needed weapons that actually worked. The proximity fuse represented more than just improved ammunition. It embodied American industrial innovation, applied to warfare's most challenging problems. In basement laboratories and factory floors across the country, civilian scientists and workers had created a weapon that could think for itself, transforming defensive fire from a game of chance into a near certainty of destruction for any aircraft that dared approach within range. The first proximity fuses reached the Pacific Fleet in January 1943, delivered to Pearl Harbor in wooden crates marked only with cryptic numerical codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz had ordered absolute secrecy surrounding the new ammunition, forbidding any written records that might reveal its capabilities if captured by enemy intelligence. Fleet gunnery officers received only verbal instructions. Use the new shells exclusively over water, recover any duds immediately, and report results through encrypted channels only. USS Helena, a light cruiser that had survived the Pearl Harbor attack with severe damage, became the first ship to fire proximity-fused ammunition in combat. Captain Gilbert Hoover watched through binoculars as Japanese Betty bombers approached his task force near Guadalcanal on January 5, 1943. The attack came at dusk, with enemy aircraft silhouetted against orange clouds as they began their bombing runs. Helena's 5-inch guns opened fire at a range of 12,000 yards, their muzzle flashes lighting the darkening sky. Instead of the usual pattern of black smoke bursts that marked mechanical time fuse detonations, The proximity fuses created bright white flashes that seemed to follow the Japanese aircraft like deadly fireflies. The first bomber disintegrated in a brilliant explosion as 3 shells detonated simultaneously within 70 feet of its fuselage. A second aircraft rolled, inverted and plunged into the sea as shrapnel from a proximity fuse tore through its starboard wing. In 15 minutes of combat, Helena fired 32 rounds of proximity-fused ammunition and claimed 6 confirmed aircraft kills. The gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Hagan, recorded the engagement with barely concealed amazement. Traditional mechanical fuses had required an average of 2,500 rounds per aircraft kill during the Guadalcanal campaign. The new ammunition achieved an 18.75% hit rate, a 50-fold improvement that seemed almost impossible to believe. But Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific Force, imposed strict operational restrictions on the revolutionary ammunition. Proximity fuses could only be used over open water, never over land where enemy forces might recover unexploded shells and reverse engineer America's secret weapon. Every dud had to be located and retrieved by Navy divers to prevent the technology from falling into Japanese hands. Ships carrying VT fuses, as they were codenamed, received orders to destroy their ammunition supplies rather than allow capture. The operational impact spread rapidly through the Pacific Fleet as more ships received the new ammunition. USS San Juan, operating near Bougainville in February, reported shooting down 4 Japanese aircraft with just 18 rounds. USS Oakland achieved similar results during night attacks near the Russell Islands, her gunners able to engage targets they could barely see in the darkness because the proximity fuses required no precise range estimation. Captain Arleigh Burke, commanding Destroyer Squadron 23, observed the transformation in fleet defensive capabilities with the analytical mind of a career naval officer. Traditional anti-aircraft fire was largely psychological warfare, Burke noted in a classified report to Admiral Nimitz. We made noise and smoke that discouraged enemy pilots but rarely brought down aircraft. These new shells actually kill planes. The psychological effect on our own crews is as important as the tactical advantage. Japanese pilots began reporting increasingly deadly American anti-aircraft fire through intercepted radio communications that Navy codebreakers translated at Pearl Harbor. American ships now possess shells that explode without direct contact. Read one captured aircrew manual from early 1943. Approach is extremely dangerous at any altitude below 18,000 feet. Japanese tactics began shifting toward higher altitude bombing runs that reduced accuracy but increased survival rates. The statistical transformation was dramatic and measurable. Pacific Fleet ammunition consumption reports showed ships equipped with proximity fuses using 85% fewer rounds to achieve the same number of aircraft kills as conventional ammunition. Rounds per kill dropped from an average of 2,500 to fewer than 150. Ship survival rates during air attacks improved by 40% as attackers were destroyed before releasing their weapons or completing their runs. Commander Joseph Crenshaw, Helena's gunnery officer during her later actions in the Solomon Islands, kept detailed records of every proximity fuse engagement. His data revealed consistent patterns. Enemy aircraft shot down at greater ranges, reduced damage to American ships, and dramatically improved crew morale among gunners who could finally see their shots achieving results. The men fight differently when they know their weapons work, Crenshaw recorded. They're more aggressive, more confident, more willing to engage targets that would have been considered hopeless with mechanical fuses. The technology's effectiveness created its own security challenges. Japanese intelligence officers, analyzing patterns in American anti-aircraft fire, correctly deduced that American shells were using some form of proximity detection system. Radio intercepts revealed Japanese speculation about radio-controlled ammunition and magnetic fuses, though they failed to identify the actual radar-based technology. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, ordered counterintelligence measures to obscure the true nature of American improvements, spreading false information about new optical ranging devices and improved mechanical fuses. By summer 1943, proximity fuses had become standard ammunition aboard every major American warship in the Pacific. Production facilities in the United States were manufacturing over 200,000 fuses per month, each one containing electronic components more sophisticated than most civilian radios. The industrial achievement was as remarkable as the tactical success. American factories had learned to mass-produce precision electronic warfare devices using assembly line techniques developed for automobiles and consumer goods. The human cost of the proximity fuse's success became visible in Japanese casualty reports intercepted by American intelligence. Experienced bomber crews, the elite of Japanese naval aviation, were being destroyed faster than training programs could replace them. The technological advantage was shifting the fundamental mathematics of air-sea warfare, making it nearly impossible for conventional aircraft to successfully attack well-defended American ships. What had begun as a desperate attempt to improve American defensive capabilities had evolved into a weapon that fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Pacific War. But the ultimate test was still coming. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was planning the largest carrier aviation strike of the Pacific War, a desperate gamble to destroy American naval power before it could support the invasion of Japan itself. The final test of American proximity fuse technology came in the waters west of Guam on June 19th and 20th, 1944, during what naval historians would later call the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Admiral Raymond Spruance's Task Force 58 centered around 15 aircraft carriers, prepared to face the largest Japanese carrier aviation strike of the Pacific War. Japanese Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had assembled 9 aircraft carriers and launched 430 aircraft in a desperate gamble to destroy American naval power before it could support the invasion of Japan itself. His plan depended on overwhelming American defensive capabilities through sheer numbers. Previous carrier battles had demonstrated that even effective anti-aircraft fire could be saturated by sufficiently large attacking formations. Ozawa's pilots had trained extensively for coordinated strikes designed to penetrate American defensive screens by attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. Intelligence reports suggested that American anti-aircraft effectiveness had improved, but Japanese naval commanders believed that concentrated attacks by experienced air crews could still achieve decisive results. They had no idea what awaited them. What the Japanese did not know was that Task Force 58 represented the most heavily defended naval formation in history. Every major ship carried proximity-fused ammunition, and the fleet's anti-aircraft batteries were coordinated by SCR-584 radar systems that could track hundreds of targets simultaneously. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the carrier task force, had positioned his ships in circular formations designed to create overlapping fields of fire that would engage incoming aircraft at maximum range. The first Japanese strike wave approached at 8:30 hours on June 19th, with 169 aircraft flying in tight formations toward the American carriers. Task Force 58 opened fire at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards, filling the sky with proximity-fused shells that detonated in brilliant white flashes among the attacking formations. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, flying Combat Air Patrol in an F-6F Hellcat, watched the spectacle through his cockpit canopy with amazement. The sky looked like the 4th of July, McCampbell later reported. Every shell seemed to find a target. Japanese planes were exploding everywhere. I'd never seen anything like it. Our anti-aircraft fire was as effective as our fighter interceptors. The mathematics of the engagement revealed the devastating effectiveness of American defensive improvements. The first Japanese strike lost 142 aircraft before reaching their targets, an attrition rate of 84% that made coordinated attacks impossible. Individual Japanese pilots, separated from their formations by anti-aircraft fire, attempted solo runs against American carriers, but were systematically destroyed by defensive systems that had achieved near-perfect intercept capabilities. Subsequent Japanese strikes met similar fates. The second wave of 110-30 aircraft lost 117 planes to American defensive fire. The third strike suffered 95% casualties, with only 7 aircraft surviving to return to their carriers. By the end of the first day, Admiral Ozawa had lost over 400 aircraft, the equivalent of his entire striking force, while inflicting minimal damage on American ships. The human cost of the technological revolution became visible in Japanese pilot reports intercepted by American radio intelligence. Enemy defensive fire is impossible to penetrate, transmitted one surviving Japanese squadron leader. Shells explode continuously around aircraft without direct hits. Recommend abandoning attack missions until new tactics are developed. But no new tactics could overcome the fundamental physics of proximity-fused ammunition. Aircraft flying within 70 feet of American shells were destroyed regardless of pilot skill or tactical innovation. Captain Arleigh Burke, observing the battle from the bridge of his destroyer, recognized the historical significance of what he was witnessing. "This isn't just a naval victory," Burke noted in his personal log. "This is the end of carrier aviation as an offensive weapon. No aircraft formation can survive defensive fire this effective. The balance of power has shifted permanently in favor of the defense." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, the Japanese pilot who had begun the day leading his squadron with confidence built from 37 previous combat missions, found himself alone in his damaged Zero, struggling to maintain altitude as his hydraulic system failed. Around him, the sky was filled with the white flashes of American proximity fuses, each detonation marking the death of another Japanese aircraft. He had watched his entire squadron disintegrate in less than 5 minutes of combat. 3 aircraft destroyed in the initial barrage, 2 more lost as they attempted to reform and continue their attack run. His wingman, a veteran of Pearl Harbor named Takeshi Yamada, had simply vanished in a brilliant explosion when an American shell detonated 20 feet from his cockpit. Abe's radio was dead, but he could see other Japanese formations across the sky, all suffering the same catastrophic losses. Aircraft exploding without being hit directly. Pilots diving desperately to escape the deadly altitude, where American shells seemed to detonate with supernatural accuracy. Some planes attempting to climb above the killing zone, only to find that American fuses worked just as effectively at 20,000 feet as they did at 10,000. The Japanese belief in superior pilot training and tactical coordination had collided with American technological superiority. All the courage and skill that Abe and his fellow pilots possessed meant nothing against shells that could sense their presence and detonate at precisely the right moment. The Americans had solved the fundamental problem of aerial warfare. They had created ammunition that never missed. Managed to nurse his crippled Zero back toward the Japanese fleet, one of the few survivors from his strike group. When he landed aboard the carrier Zuikaku 3 hours later, he found the deck crowded with damaged aircraft and wounded pilots. The air group commander was taking preliminary casualty reports. Of the 169 aircraft that had launched that morning, only 27 had returned. Some had been shot down by American fighters, but the majority had been destroyed by anti-aircraft fire of unprecedented accuracy. The debriefing revealed the shocking truth. Every squadron reported the same experience. American shells that seemed to follow Japanese aircraft. Explosions that occurred precisely when planes flew close enough to be damaged. Defensive fire that was impossible to evade or overcome through tactical maneuvers. Japanese pilots had trained to handle conventional anti-aircraft fire by varying their altitude and approach angles, making timing calculations difficult for enemy gunners. These new American shells required no timing calculations. They simply waited until targets came within range, then detonated automatically. Admiral Ozawa faced the devastating reality that evening, as damage reports confirmed the destruction of his air groups. He had launched 430 aircraft that morning. Fewer than 100 survived the day. Most had been destroyed not by American fighters, but by defensive fire that achieved kill rates previously considered impossible. The attack had failed completely, inflicting trivial damage on American forces while destroying Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American pilots nicknamed the engagement, represented more than tactical success. It marked the end of Japanese naval aviation's ability to challenge American naval supremacy in the Pacific. The industrial achievement underlying this military triumph was equally remarkable. American factories had produced over 22 million proximity fuses by war's end, each containing electronic components more sophisticated than most commercial radios of the era. The miniaturization techniques developed for artillery shells had pushed American electronics manufacturing decades ahead of pre-war capabilities. Workers in plants across the Midwest, many of them women who had entered industrial employment for the first time, were mass-producing precision electronic devices using techniques that would later enable the post-war electronics revolution. Dr. Merle Tuve, now directing proximity fuse production from his expanded laboratories at Johns Hopkins, reflected on the transformation his team had achieved. The South Dakota farm boy who had approached an impossible problem by breaking it into manageable pieces had created a weapon that fundamentally altered the nature of warfare. "We didn't set out to revolutionize military technology," Tuve observed in a post-war interview. "We just wanted American sailors to come home alive. But sometimes the most important innovations come from asking questions that everyone else considers impossible to answer." The proximity fuse's effectiveness extended beyond naval warfare. By August 1944, 2 months after the D-Day landings, General Omar Bradley faced a tactical problem that threatened Allied supply operations across Western Europe. German V-1 flying bombs launched from sites in occupied France and Holland were targeting the crucial port of Antwerp with devastating accuracy. The unmanned weapons flew at 350 miles per hour at altitudes between 1,000 and 3,000 feet, too low for heavy bombers to intercept effectively, too fast for conventional anti-aircraft fire to engage reliably. Bradley had watched proximity fuses transform naval warfare in the Pacific, but Admiral King's security restrictions had prevented their use over land where enemy forces might recover unexploded shells. The risk of German engineers reverse engineering America's most closely guarded military secret had outweighed any tactical advantage. But with Allied beachheads secure in Normandy and German forces retreating across France, Bradley argued for lifting the restrictions. The port of Antwerp handled more Allied supplies than any other European facility. Its loss to V-1 attacks could delay the advance into Germany by months. The decision came from the highest levels of command. General Dwight Eisenhower, after consultation with the combined chiefs of staff, authorized the use of proximity fuses for anti-aircraft defense of critical Allied installations. The benefits to Allied operations outweighed the security risks, particularly as German research facilities fell increasingly under Allied control. On August 15th, the first land-based anti-aircraft batteries received shipments of VT fuses with orders to defend Antwerp harbour at all costs. Colonel James Maurice, commanding the Antwerp Anti-Aircraft Defence Command, deployed his 90mm guns in carefully planned positions around the port facilities. His gunners had trained extensively with mechanical time fuses, achieving intercept rates of approximately 20% against V-1 targets during previous engagements. The flying bombs followed predictable flight paths and maintained constant speeds, making them easier targets than manned aircraft, but their small size and low altitude still challenged conventional anti-aircraft techniques. The first major test came on August 22nd when German forces launched a concentrated barrage of 47 Vohn-second against Antwerp's dock facilities. Maurice's guns opened fire at maximum range, their proximity-fused shells creating brilliant flashes against the grey morning sky. The result exceeded even the most optimistic predictions from Pacific Fleet reports. 39 Vohn-second were destroyed before reaching their targets, an intercept rate of 83% that seemed almost impossible given previous performance with conventional ammunition. Technical Sergeant Robert Hayes, operating an SCR-584 radar at Battery C, watched the engagement through his scope with fascination. "The shells were following the bombs like they were alive," Hayes later reported. "Every time a V-1 appeared on my screen, the proximity shells would detonate right on top of it. We were shooting down targets we could barely see with equipment that seemed to think faster than we could." The operational impact extended far beyond individual engagements. Allied supply operations through Antwerp continued uninterrupted as V-1 attacks became increasingly futile. German intelligence reports, intercepted by Allied codebreakers, revealed growing frustration with the ineffectiveness of their flying bomb campaign. Enemy defensive fire has achieved near-total interception capability, Read one decoded message from German 15th Army headquarters. V1 operations against Antwerp are no longer cost-effective. Luftwaffe tactical manuals began reflecting the new reality of Allied anti-aircraft capabilities. Captured documents from late 1944 contained explicit warnings about approaching Allied-controlled territory below 20,000 feet. German pilots reported that American and British anti-aircraft fire had become so accurate that low-altitude missions were tantamount to suicide. The proximity fuse had fundamentally altered the mathematics of air-ground combat, just as it had transformed naval warfare. Production statistics revealed the massive industrial effort required to supply proximity fuses to both Pacific and European theaters simultaneously. American factories were producing over 400,000 fuses per month by autumn 1944, with unit costs dropping to $18 each, less than the cost of conventional mechanical fuses when factoring in improved effectiveness. Vacuum tubes, precision timing circuits, a spring-powered generator, and radio components more sophisticated than most commercial receivers, all manufactured to artillery-grade durability standards. The human dimension of the proximity fuse's success became visible in Allied casualty statistics. Ports, airfields, and supply depots that had previously suffered regular damage from German air attacks now operated with minimal disruption. Allied bomber crews reported dramatically reduced losses to German anti-aircraft fire as Luftwaffe fighter strength declined due to fuel shortages and pilot casualties. The technological advantage was cascading through every aspect of the air war over Europe. Captain William Patterson, commanding Battery A of the 320th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, observed the psychological transformation among his gunners. "The men fight with confidence now," Patterson noted in his unit diary. "They know their shells will hit what they're aimed at. Instead of hoping for lucky shots, they're calculating intercept courses and engaging targets that would have been impossible with mechanical fuses." The proximity fuse had changed not just the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire, but the mentality of the soldiers operating the guns. German attempts to develop countermeasures proved largely unsuccessful. Luftwaffe technical intelligence had correctly identified that American shells were using some form of radio proximity detection, but their attempts to jam or deceive the fuses failed to account for the sophisticated discrimination circuits developed by Fuze's team. German radar jammers, designed to confuse Allied aircraft navigation systems, had no effect on proximity fuses, which operated on different frequencies and used entirely different signal processing techniques. By winter 1944, proximity fuses had become standard ammunition for every major Allied anti-aircraft installation in Europe. The technology that had begun as a desperate attempt to improve American naval defenses after Pearl Harbor had evolved into a comprehensive solution for the air defense problem that had plagued military forces since aircraft first appeared over battlefields in World War I. The age of effective defensive fire had finally arrived, fundamentally altering the balance between offensive air power and ground-based defenses. The proximity fuse's legacy extended far beyond its military applications. The vacuum tube miniaturization techniques developed for artillery shells became the foundation for post-war electronics advancement. The precision manufacturing methods required for mass-producing complex electronic devices enabled the consumer electronics industry that would transform American society in the 1950s and 60s. The tiny radar transmitters that had to survive being shot from cannons led directly to the development of transistors, integrated circuits, and eventually the microprocessors that would power the digital revolution. By war's end, proximity fuses had achieved a 61-fold improvement in anti-aircraft effectiveness, while consuming 85% fewer rounds per target destroyed. The technology had saved an estimated 100,000 American lives by improving ship survival rates and reducing aircraft losses. More importantly, it had demonstrated that American industrial innovation, properly directed and adequately funded, could solve seemingly impossible technical problems and tip the balance of warfare through superior engineering rather than superior numbers. For Japanese pilots like Lieutenant Zenji Abe, the proximity fuse represented something more personal and more devastating. It represented the moment when courage and skill became irrelevant against technology. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Abe flew only 3 more combat missions before being grounded due to aircraft shortages. Japan simply couldn't replace the pilots and planes, lost to American defensive fire. He survived the war and spent decades afterward trying to understand what had happened above the Philippine Sea. In interviews conducted in the 1970s, Abe described the psychological impact of facing weapons that seemed impossible to evade. "We were trained to handle anti-aircraft fire by changing altitude and speed," he explained. "But these American shells didn't care what we did. They waited for us. They found us. They killed us. It was like fighting ghosts." The small device that had begun as Merle Tuve's ridiculous idea, dismissed by military brass as impossible fantasy, had become the weapon that ended the age of aircraft terror. It proved that sometimes the most powerful innovations come not from building bigger guns, but from teaching existing weapons how to think for themselves. American factories produced shells that exploded before missing, and in doing so, changed warfare forever. Thank you for watching. For more detailed, historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.